All right, I appreciate everyone being here. If you're watching this, you're watching it live on TikTok, but also we are on going to be uploading this to YouTube after it's finished. What you see on when you do it, okay. So what you see in for on TikTok, those of you, we are talking about. Make sure. Okay, so we've already looked at in part one and part two, and I didn't discuss everything. There's a lot more that probably we could have spoken about how the Book of Mormon, as we have investigated, is not from God. So that leans it must have came from man. And where's the most probable location? And I say this out of love. I know that people don't think that I love them, but I do. I care for their souls and want them to come to the knowledge of the truth. And so I recently learned about this Light and Truth letter that's written by Fife. And I thought, and he's from what I haven't read all of it. I've read parts of it. I've read this part especially. And so I wanted to read to you someone who wants to try to defend the Book of Mormon. And so he'll say this, and so let's read it, and then we will continue with the seminar of our slides. So Fife says, the Book of Mormon haunted me when I attempted to leave the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. No matter how hard I tried, I could not develop a working naturalistic theory explaining the Book of Mormon that made sense. Any theory asserted by critics only brought up more questions. Who wrote the Book of Mormon? Joseph Smith was a poor farm boy from upstate New York with a limited frontier education. Until the Book of Mormon, he had never written a book or demonstrated a knack for long dictation, and when the original manuscript was finished in the summer of 1829, Joseph was 23 years old. Critics attempt to explain the Book of Mormon with far-fetched and contradictory claims. If not by divine means, how did Joseph Smith come up with the Book of Mormon? If it wasn't from God or Joseph, then where did it come from? Who wrote it? Historians generally concede that Joseph Smith had metal plates of some kind. Where did he get them from? How could he afford the gold or brass or lead lead to make the plates? Could he have assembled them? And with no experience in metallurgy, why are there no witnesses to him fabricating plates? If someone else wrote the Book of Mormon, why did no one come forward? Sidney Rigdon was an educated preacher and an early church leader. Critics sometimes say that he wrote the Book of Mormon or provided material for it. If that is true, notice the question he asks, how was he converted in November of 1830 by the book he wrote in 1829? Well, who says it was 1829 only? Could be several years, actually. And then he never took credit for it? Well, I don't know about you, Mr. Fife, but there are two things you need to. There's several things you need to listen to, and this is just two of them. There could be more as we'll explain throughout the seminar. But I think about James Jeffries, how what Sidney Rigdon told him, and then you have to also think about what Sidney Rigdon's grandson said about this. So basically, that's all that he says for in regards to Sidney Rigdon. Okay, so we want to give some attention to this, but I just wanted to show you what some say in regards to this matter. Now let me change it over to. Oops. All right, let me fix this if you don't mind. So that. Okay. All right. And we are on it. Okay. So let's begin. Okay. This is very important to talk about this matter. So we have to begin with Solomon Spaulding. He lived from 1761, born in Ashford, Connecticut. He died in Amity, Pennsylvania in 1816. Some things to know about him: studied at Plainfield Academy, served in the Revolutionary War in Colonel Obadiah Johnson's regiment. Of course, remember the war ended in October 1781 at Yorktown. He went to basically study law with Zephaniah Swift in Connecticut, but he changed to ministry at Dartmouth College in around the age 21. He obtained his BA in 1785, so he was around 24 at the time. I just wanted to show you a record of him in the service. You can find that in a book on archive.org. So he studied divinity privately, it seemed to be the case, and he was licensed to preach by Wyndham Congregationalist Association. He was 26 by that time. He might have got his MA degree, 1788, but that's undocumented, so he was around 27 years old. He married Matilda Sabine around age 34. He moved to Cherry Valley, New York, and then he proceeded to help his younger brother Josiah at a general store, and he was serving as principal of Cherry Valley Academy. Well, then he seemed to have been he was replaced by Eliphalet Knott there. He was also appointed Justice of the Peace. He moved to Richfield, New York, about 16 miles west, operating the general store. He bought frontier land on credit to sell to settlers at some point. He entered a partnership with Gideon Granger. He turned out to be a bad dealing for Spalding. Took frequent trips to Conneaut from 1803 to 1809. He surveyed lots, completed legal arrangements for sales, wanted to construct a forge at Conneaut Creek. It came to a halt. He actually suffered a very serious rupture. He returned to New York with Josiah. He suffered financial losses due to political disputes over boundary lines and a failure of tenants not paying him. So he moved back to Conneaut. We know he had some short stays, several months in 1809 with Oliver Smith. He recommenced the construction of a forge in 1809. He took on a partner, Henry Lake, in 1811. We actually have the deed, or the partnership deed that they made together. The War of 1812 occurred. Sailors did not wish to purchase land in a war zone. Basically, Spalding owed a lot of money to creditors. Spalding had to turn to his hobby of writing, and he was working on a book, and he wanted to publish a book to pay off creditors. He'd written 2 manuscripts that we know. Now, some are going to say, wait a minute, Shane, no, he only wrote 1. And the reason we can know that he wrote 2 was because of the statement by Aaron Wright, which we will come to in due time. And plus the different details between the 2 manuscripts. So let's keep going. So he had written 2 manuscripts. The first one, manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, which is a Roman story. He discarded it, never finished it. In fact, it has an abrupt ending. It was discovered in 1884 in Honolulu, Hawaii. And number 2, there's a manuscript called a manuscript found, or a manuscript found, written in the old style, written like the King James. And he started it in Conneaut, Ohio, and he read it aloud to his neighbors and friends. He moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the early autumn of 1812. And we know, like I've told you before, this manuscript story, the first one was found and located, and it's now at Oberlin College. And then the manuscript found, ironically, it remains lost. All right, so manuscript story from 1809 to 1812. Manuscript found 1812 to 1814. Spalding, sadly, he goes to try to get it published in 1812, around that time, but he keeps on editing it. But he dies in 1816. Now, why am I discussing this? Because we know that the Book of Mormon came out in 1830. So, in the year 1832, we see Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith, which was Joseph Smith's brother, delivered a sermon on the Book of Mormon at a schoolhouse in Conneaut, Ohio. And Nehemiah King, and which we know from the draft letter of Aaron Wright, an old friend of Solomon Spalding's, recognized it as Spalding's work, and friends and relatives of Spalding agreed with King. So this is that Aaron Wright draft letter I was talking about. So D.P. Halbert, he had gotten the witness statements. Then he went to fetch for the manuscript. He brought back the first manuscript. He showed it to these witnesses. that manuscript story, Conneaut Creek. So this is what was written. This is what Aaron Wright said. Whereas I have been informed that you have been appointed with others to investigate the subject of Mormonism, and a resolution has been passed to ascertain the real origin of the said book. This is therefore to inform you that I have made a statement to D.P. Hulbert relative to the writings of Solomon Spaulding, Esquire. Said Hulbert is now at my store. I have examined the writings which he has obtained from said Spaulding's widow. So notice he's examined this manuscript story. I recognize them to be the writings, handwritings of said Spaulding, but not the manuscript I had reference to in my statement before alluded to. As he informed me, he wrote in the first place, he wrote it for his own amusement and then altered his plan and commenced writing a history of the first settlement of America. The particulars you will find in my testimony, dated August 1833. For years before he left this place, I was quite intimate with said Solomon Spaulding. We had many private interviews. The history he was writing was the topic of his conversation, relating his progress and contemplating the avails of the same. I also contemplated reading his history, but never saw it in print until I saw the Book of Mormon, where I find much of the history and the names verbatim. The Book of Mormon does not contain all the writings, said Spaulding's. I expect to see them if Smith is permitted to go on and, as he says, get his other plates. The first time that Mr. Hyde, a Mormon preacher from Kirtland, preached in the Center Schoolhouse in this place, the Honorable Nehemiah King attended as soon as Hyde had got through. King left the house and said that Hyde had preached from the writings of Solomon Spaulding. So that's why we're talking about this, that there is a connection being made between from those who lived in Conneaut, Ohio, that connects to Solomon Spaulding, who wrote Manuscript Found. All right, now let's go to 1831, a second piece of evidence. And notice that this is independent. So it says, the Painesville Telegraph of this morning has the particulars of the acceptance of a challenge by Thomas Campbell, given by a noted mountebank by the name of Elder Rigdon, who has flourished in and about the openings for the last few years, and to the no small wonderment of all the old women round about that country, to test the validity of the doctrine contained in the Book of Mormon. It is something singular this subject should have created such a stir. The editor of the Telegraph has opened his paper to a discussion of its merits and demerits. Oh. So I'll make sure. Okay. See how many people are. Okay, so it says, he keeps on saying, Rigdon was formerly a disciple of Campbell's, and who it is said was sent out to make proselytes, but it's probable he thought he should have found it more advantageous to operate on his own capital, and therefore wrote, as is believed, the Book of Mormon. So right there we see the first connection between the Book of Mormon and Sidney Rigdon. Notice it's an independent connection. It's not a connection between Spaulding and the Book of Mormon, but a connection between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. So we have 1 year after the Book of Mormon is published, there's a connection between Book of Mormon and Sidney Rigdon. And then 1 year later, an independent group comes between a connection between Solomon Spaulding and the Book of Mormon. Now, third piece of evidence. So I'm not going to read all of this, but basically James Gordon Bennett was a newspaper journalist. He wrote down in his journal, and he says, Henry Sidney Rigdon, I don't know why he came up with the name Henry, a parson general, smart fellow. He is the author of the Bible, Book of Mormon. Okay, it's very interesting that he says that. And then he wrote 2 articles in the newspaper. And so he says in part of it, and for some reason he spells the name wrong. After the lapse of some weeks, the expedition was completed, and the famous Ohio man, which we know that Sidney Rigdon was from that area, made his appearance among them. This recruit was the most cunning, intelligent, and all of the whole. He had been a preacher of almost every religion, a teacher of all sorts of morals. He was perfectly perfectly off thought with every species of prejudice, folly, or fanaticism which governs the mass of enthusiasts. I'm just going to skip if that's okay. His name, I believe, is Henry Wrangden or Ringdon, or some such word. In face of this hill, the money diggers renewed their work with fresh ardor, Ringdon partly uniting with them in their operations. Okay, so he talks about this connection, once again, as he made in his diary, between Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. All right, now we're going to go to, so we see the connection now between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. All right, so is there a connection between Solomon Spaulding, Sidney Rigdon, and the Book of Mormon? That's what we want to look at. So you remember I talked to you about this idea that this was not unique about the Israelites coming from, or the Israelites becoming the Native Americans. Okay, that's nothing new. In fact, so remember we have Orson Hyde and Smith going to Conneaut, Ohio in February of 1832, and the connection is made to Solomon Spaulding. And then in 1831, a year earlier, connection was made to Sidney Rigdon, and Ben Bennett made a connection also to Sidney Rigdon. Okay. And then Holbert was a convert to the LDS Church for a little while. He actually went on a mission, and he came across this. He came across learning about Solomon Spaulding in some way. And he may have gotten it from Jackson. Okay, so this is all. You can find this in Benjamin Winchester's work. It's where you'll find it. Now, Benjamin Winchester talks about how he learned of the first manuscript. Okay. So there is some ambiguity here in this part, and I'll admit that. Somehow we know that he got into connection with John and Martha Spaulding, which John Spaulding was one of the brothers of Solomon Spaulding. So he took down a statement in August of 1833. Now, I wish we could read all of these. I think that's very important. But we're going to look at one of these. So it says, Solomon Spaulding was born in Ashford, Connecticut in 1761. In the year 1809, he removed to Conneaut in Ohio. The year following, I removed to Ohio. Found him engaged in building a forge. I made him a visit in Pittsburgh, and about 3 years after, found that he had failed and was considerably involved in debt. He then told he had been writing a book, which he intended to have printed, the avails of which he thought would enable him to pay all debts. The book was entitled Manuscript Found, of which he read to me many passages. It was a historical romance of the first settlers of America, endeavored to show that the American Indians are the descendants of the Jews or the lost tribes. It gave a detailed account of their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea, until they arrived in America under the command of Lehi and Nephi. They afterwards had quarrels and contentions and separated into two distinct nations, one of which he denominated Nephites, the other Lamanites. Cruel and bloody wars ensued, in which great multitudes were slain. They buried their dead in large heaps, which caused the mounds so common in this country. Their art, sciences, and civilization were all brought into view, in order to account for all the curious antiquities found in various parts of North and South America. I have recently read the Book of Mormon, and to my great surprise, I find it nearly the same historical matter, names, etc., as they were in my brother's writings. I well remember that he wrote in the old style and commenced almost every sentence with, and it came to pass, or now it came to pass. The same as in the Book of Mormon. And what's interesting is the first manuscript does not contain, it came to pass. And according to the best of my recollection, belief is the same as my brother Solomon wrote, with the exception of the religious matter. Now, isn't that an undesigned coincidence? Who could insert religious material? Who could transform this novel, historical novel, into a filled with sermons and theological material? And I would tell you, he didn't know anything about Sidney Rigdon. And so notice how this fits together like a glove fits into a hand. But what means is fallen in the hands of Joseph Smith, I'm unable to determine. Wouldn't expect you to know, John. Now, Martha also wrote. She also wrote an affidavit, wrote her witness statement. And then we know that Halbert went to go visit Aaron Wright, Nahum Howard, Oliver Smith, and got their witness statements. Now, let's go ahead and read Aaron Wright, since I read to you that draft letter. Remember, he said, I have made a statement already to Halbert of the said book. So let's see what he says. I first became acquainted with Solomon Spaulding in 1808 or 1809 when he commenced building a forge on Conneaut Creek. When at his house one day, he showed and read to me a history he was writing of the lost tribes of Israel, purporting that they were the first settlers of America, and that by Indians, and that the Indians were their descendants. Upon the subject, we had frequent conversations. He traced their journey from Jerusalem to America, as is given in the Book of Mormon, excepting the religious matter. The historical part of the Book of Mormon I know to be the same as I read and heard from the writings of Spaulding more than 20 years ago. The names are more, especially the same without any alteration. He told me his object was to account for all the fortifications to be found in this country, and that in time it would be fully believed by all except learned men and historians. I once anticipated reading his writings in print, but little expected to see there in a new Bible. Spaulding had many other manuscripts, which I expect to see when Smith translates his other plate. In conclusion, I will observe that the names of and most of the historical part of the Book of Mormon were as familiar to me before I read it as most modern history. If it's not Spaulding's writing, it is the same as he wrote. And if Smith was inspired, I think it was by the same spirit that Spaulding was, which he confessed to be the love of money. And so there were other men that were also talked about. Henry Lake, Halbert went to get their statements. Henry Lake, which was a co-partner with Solomon Spaulding, worked with him on the forge, and John Miller also worked with them. R.M.S. Cunningham was actually a man who visited Spaulding about a debt. So it's September of 1833. Well, they formed this committee in Mentor, Ohio. And like I said, here are some of the, I wish we could read all these statements. And I think what we'll do later on is actually we will get to some of the details of what they wrote. So you're welcome to stop reading them yourself, because some of them do give a few different additional details that actually help to fit together the puzzle pieces. Okay. So all those people were revisited. And so he got this committee going, and Halbert is going to visit Matilda Davidson, who had remarried, and gets to her place November 22nd, 1833. Now, he was able to inquire from her where the trunk would be located, which contained a manuscript of Spaulding's. He did get the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, which passed from D.P. Halbert to E.D. Howe eventually. E.D. Howe gave it to his brother, who took over the Painesville Telegraph, which went on to L.L. Rice and Philander Winchester. And then that Rice went on to Honolulu, Hawaii, and he accidentally found the manuscript. He was looking for anti-slavery material that he had brought with him, and Rice turns it over to his friend James Fairchild of Oberlin College. Now, E.D. Howe believed it was destroyed in a fire in 1841, but as you can see, it was rediscovered. Moving on. All right, so now where we're going is Halbert. So he got the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, from Matilda Davidson. He goes to Palmer Tucker, who is the editor for a magazine, and this magazine article was published. Newspaper article was published December 20th, 1833, and he put it in it believed to be the notorious Rigdon. And so Halbert must have learned this from the widow of Solomon Spaulding. And so there's a connection now between Halbert and Spaulding and Rigdon. So that is really the main discovery here. as you can see, how this all fits together. That Matilda tells Hulbert about Rigdon. And so now we see how the connections fit together. Okay, so Hulbert goes to that committee. Now, James Briggs is an anomaly. It's kind of interesting to read. He's interviewed several times, and he actually claims that he actually read what was called manuscript found, another manuscript. He believes that Rigdon may have sold this manuscript to the Mormons. That's disputed. We just don't know. But it's very interesting to read his statements, and that's all I can say about that. Now, like we said, Hulbert journeys back to Conneaut, Ohio. He visits with, we know, Aaron Wright, and we know he visited several others like Oliver Smith and some others. And that's why this draft letter was written. Hulbert showed manuscript story, the first manuscript, to Aaron Wright, and Aaron Wright says, no, that's not the right manuscript I'm referring to. It is Solomon Spaulding's writings, but it's not the one I have reference to in my statement. Very interesting. Now, that leads us to how Aaron Wright he said Orson Hyde had visited them in 1832. Okay. Now, Hulbert does give the witness statements to E.D. Howe. And what E.D. Howe did is he actually goes and visits these witnesses. So I want you to see what he says here. We're going to skip a little bit of this, if that's okay, because I want to get to the main part. So he says, in some way, Hulbert learned of Solomon Spaulding, who wrote a fiction at Conneaut, Ohio in 1810 or 11, which he called Manuscript Found. John Spaulding, a brother Solomon, directed him to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Solomon had taken his manuscript to have it printed. He learned Mrs. Spaulding was in Massachusetts and went there and obtained an order from her to go to Hartwick, New York, for another copy. Hulbert returned to Ohio, lectured about the county on the origin of Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. I heard him lecture in Painesville. He finally came to me to have his evidence he had obtained published. I bargained to pay him in books, which I sent to him at Conneaut, Ohio. Now, notice, I really respect the integrity of E.D. Howe here. He says, before publishing my book, I went to Conneaut and saw most of the witnesses who had seen Spaulding's manuscript found and had testified to its identity with the Book of Mormon when it was published in my book, and was satisfied they were men of intelligence, respectability, and were not mistaken in their statements. And this is a sad part to me, I published only a small part of the statements Hulbert let me have. And he says, I was not acquainted with Hulbert until he came to me to have this evidence published. And he says he published his book on November 28th, 1834. So, we see that the statements are published in Mormonism Unveiled in 1834. All right, so then that's what the book looks like. And it was misspelled, unfortunately. Or maybe that's the obsolete way they used to say it, actually. All right, so what about manuscript found, right? Well, we know in regards to that, we just don't know. Okay? But with regards to the first manuscript, story, Conneaut Creek, we know that these three, at least, made statements that this is the writings of Solomon Spaulding. All right. Then what we have is Matilda Davidson, the wife, the widow, Joseph Miller and Reddick McKee, who lived in Amity, Pennsylvania, where Solomon Spaulding, he lived in Pittsburgh at a time, and he went down to live in Amity, about 10, 12 miles south of Pittsburgh. So we have their statements, and they wrote several statements. As you can see, there's 3 written by Joseph Miller, and there's also Reddick McKee. Okay, now I want you to bring your attention now to Jesse J. Moss, who wrote about these Conneaut witnesses. So I can't read all of what Jesse J. Moss said to James C. Cobb, but he says this: one fact I will give you, I met an ex-judge of the county court of Ashtabula County, Ohio at Conneaut, in that county, who told me that he read Spalding's romance in manuscript week by week, day by day, as it was written, that the Book of Mormon was the same except the religious element that had been added to it. And I had the clerk's office in connection with an iron smelting works pointed out to me where it was written and where the judge read it, he being one of the owners of said works. And definitely he's referring to Aaron Wright there. And then we have James Barr Walker. So that was Moss wrote that in 1878. But here we have something written in 1834, before Mormonism Unveiled was published. So James Barr Walker says this: one man with whom I conversed said he recollected the names of the characters and places, and then it generally remained the same in the Book of Mormon as is the manuscript of Spalding. He feels not the least hesitation in testifying to this and to the identity of the works as so far as it relates to the narrative or historical part. Indeed, the resemblance is so striking that it was detected the first evening the Mormonites preached in that place, merely from the passages read in the book during service. There is all the certainty on the subject in the minds of those who have seen the manuscript that could be felt in any case, unless the two books could be laid side by side and compared. One man, especially by the name of Miller, John Miller, who worked for Mr. Spalding several weeks, perhaps months, states that the manuscript lay on a shelf or in the room where he slept, and that he spent many of his leisure hours in reading it, so long as he worked at the house. So, discussed with John Miller, co-worker of Spalding. Okay. Next, we have some people who testify and say that these were good, respectable men who were honest. Okay. So there was children, acquaintances, co-workers of the witnesses of Spalding. I wish we could read a lot of them. But to be honest, I'm going to have to skip some. Okay. So, but they all talk about how they were good citizens, basically. Okay. Then we have Robert Harper, Daniel Spencer, William Leffingwell, Cephas Dodd, who came along later. And they also talk about Solomon Spalding in the manuscript found. There's also his Matilda Davidson, Joseph Miller, and Reddick McKee, as we already said. So in 1839, Matilda Davidson actually wrote in a newspaper. She used some men who dictated the interview, and it was put in a newspaper. I wish we could read a lot of this. It's really interesting to read. But I want to read one of these parts here. Now, I will say, unfortunately, she's not right in all the details that she said, just to let y'all know. But she does say in that second paragraph, Sidney Rigdon, who has figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson and is well known in that region. As Rigdon himself has frequently stated, here he has ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spalding's manuscript and to copy it if he chose. It was a matter of notoriety and interest to all who were connected with the printing establishment. At length, the manuscript was returned to its author and soon after was removed to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Spalding deceased in 1816. So I'm going to skip some of this, so it's okay. All right, now Reddick McKee is pretty interesting. You could read about what he wrote. It's very, very interesting. It does talk about the Amalekites and the red mark on the foreheads, which you can actually find in Alma chapter 3, which we will get to at some point. But we have Joseph Miller's statement, who was the Amity neighbor. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you all this, that you can find a lot of this in my 35-part series on YouTube, just to let you know. I just wanted to let you know that I'm just giving you people that you can look at for yourself. You have even the daughter of Solomon Spalding who gave her statement about this. And there's Abner Jackson, who also wrote about this. So as you can see, there's a lot of people. Okay. Now, there's even Josiah Spalding, younger brother of Solomon Spalding. Now, Josiah visited him at some point, and he visited when he was working on his first manuscript. I think it's very interesting. Let me. Now, here's something that Josiah says. He says he soon after moved to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, where he lived a while, and then moved farther to a place where he died. His widow then returned to the state of New York and lived there a while, and then came to Connecticut. She informed me, if I recollect right, that my brother continued his history of the civilized nation and the progress of the war until the triumph of the savages' destruction of the civilized government. Likewise, she informed me that soon after they arrived at Pittsburgh, and a man followed them. I do not recollect his name. No, she informed him. So this is secondhand testimony. But he was afterwards known to be a leading Mormon. He got into the employment of a printer and told the printer about my brother's composition. Printer called and requested the privilege of taking it home to read. He, my brother, let him take it. He kept it some time, then he urged him, my brother, to let him print it. He, my brother, would not consent, but took it back and she said that she brought it to New York and put it into a chest where she lived. At that time, when she was from home, a stranger called upon her and requested to let him see the novel that her husband composed. He said that he lived at the West, and it was reported there that it gave rise to Mormonism. So I would say that even with some of what Josiah Spalding had said, that some of the details that he said are not perfectly consistent. And so, like I say, this theory is not perfect by no means. All right, then, so like I said, Josiah Spalding, and then Robert Patterson, the one who, the printer. So he talks about, in this character, he informed Robert Patterson that a gentleman from the East originally had put into his hands a manuscript of a singular work, chiefly in the style of our English translation of the Bible, handed the copy to Robert Patterson, who read only a few pages, and finding nothing apparently exceptionable. He said to Ingalls he might publish it if the author furnished the funds or good security. He, the author, failing to comply with the terms, Mr. Ingalls returned the manuscript as supposed at the time, after it had been some weeks in his possession with other manuscripts in the office. Now, we think that there were two brothers who worked at this printing office, and probably most likely Solomon Spalding knew Joseph Patterson better, it seems like, from other connections that are made. But I wish we could delve into this more, because I would just like for you to read the statements for yourself. All right, so what's interesting is these people on the left-hand side, some of them are secondhand testimony, unfortunately. I mean, someone else told someone else. They made the connection between Spalding and Rigdon. So we have a lady who once worked at the post office. She says, I knew and distinctly remember Robert and Joseph Patterson, J. Harrison Lambden, Silas Ingalls, and Sidney Rigdon. I remember Reverend Mr. Spalding, but simply as one who occasionally called to inquire for letters. I remember there was an evident intimacy between Lambden and Rigdon, and they very often came to the office together. He says, she also said, I recall Mr. Ingalls saying that Rigdon was always hanging around the printing office. He was connected with the tannery before he became a preacher, though he may have continued the business whilst preaching. And what's interesting is, okay, so one of the arguments or objections that is made is that Sidney Rigdon did not live in Pittsburgh. It's true, he did not live in Pittsburgh until 1822, but that's not what we're talking about. We wanted to ask about, did he frequently visit Pittsburgh? And people would actually, post office, or I don't know who would do this, but if you didn't come get your letters from the mail, they actually put your name they actually put your name in the newspaper to come get your letters. And so it just so happens that Solomon Spalding, he had some letters he had to come get, and Sidney Rigdon had some letters. And the fact that we actually have several times where Sidney Rigdon had to come and get and Solomon Spalding, they had to come get their letters. which is kind of interesting. So that means at other times, it must be the case that Rigdon is visiting the Pittsburgh so he can get his mail. Okay, so that's something to think about here. Now we have Joseph Miller, very close to Spalding, who nursed him. And Spalding told me that Sidney Rigdon had taken it or suspected of taking it. I recollect distinctly that Rigdon's name was mentioned in connection with it. Now, John Winter, unfortunately, is second-hand testimony. But he says Dr. Winter was in Rigdon's study when the latter took from his desk a large manuscript and said in substance, a Presbyterian minister, Spalding, whose health has failed, brought this to the printer to see if it would pay to publish it. It is a romance of the Bible. Dr. Winter did not read any part of it, paid no more attention to it until after the Book of Mormon appeared, when he heard that Mr. Spalding's widow recognized in it the writings of her husband. We have Mary Irvin, who attests to this. We have, and also stepson, A.J. Bonsall. And then there's Reddick McKee. I wish we could look more at that. Now, this is really interesting. The niece of Sidney Rigdon. She says, when I was quite a child, I visited Mr. Rigdon's family. He married my aunt. They, at that time, lived in Bainbridge, Ohio, and during my visit, Mr. Rigdon went to his bedroom, took from a trunk, which he kept locked, a certain manuscript. He came out into the other room, seated himself by the fireplace, commenced reading it. His wife at that moment came into the room and exclaimed, "What? You're studying that thing again?" Or something to that effect. She then added, "I mean to burn that paper." He said, "No, indeed you will not. This will be a great thing someday." And whenever he was reading this, he was so completely occupied that he seemed entirely unconscious of anything passing around him. And then we have Cephas Dodd, who took Mr. French to Spalding's grave and there told him his positive belief that Rigdon was the agent in transforming Spalding's manuscript into the Book of Mormon. We have Harvey Baldwin. Unfortunately, it's second-hand testimony. We got Deacon Clapp. We have Anne Redfield. Miss Spalding believed that Sidney Rigdon had copied the manuscript while it was in... I remember... Let's see. She says... Well... She says... Mrs. Spalding believed that Sidney Rigdon had copied the manuscript while it was in Patterson's printing office in Pittsburgh. So she is repeating what the widow said. There's Josiah Spalding, which we already talked about. There's C.E. Henry. There's also Dency Thompson. Now, this one's very interesting. We were in the receipt of a letter from Mr. O.P. Henry, an Astoria subscriber, who says in reference to an article in the Oregon of recent date concerning the origin of the Mormon Bible, that his mother, who is yet alive, lived in the family of Sidney Rigdon for several years prior to her marriage in 1827, that there was in the family what is now called a writing medium, also several others in adjacent places. And the Mormon Bible was written by 2 or 3 different persons by an automatic power, which they believe was inspiration direct from God. The same is produced by the original Jewish Bible and Christian New Testament. Mr. H. believes that Sidney Rigdon furnished Joseph Smith with these manuscripts and that the story of the hieroglyphics was a fabrication to make the credulous take hold of the mystery. And this would be Dency Thompson. Now, probably some maybe of these details are wrong. And then there's William Smith, who told Joseph if he did not, this is secondhand testimony, unfortunately, who told Joseph that if he had not given some money, he would tell where the Book of Mormon came from, and Joseph accordingly gave him what he wanted. There's R.W. Arterman. Sidney Rigdon, a renegade preacher, was let in during the translation, and Rigdon had stolen a manuscript from the printing office in Pittsburgh, which Spalding, who had written it in the early part of the century, had left there to be printed, but the printers refused to publish it, but Joan Rigdon did as the Book of Mormon. Now, this is really interesting, John C. Bennett. Now, John C. Bennett is... in the LDS Church, how they view him, is something to be asked. But he does say I'll remark here in confirmation above that the Book of Mormon was originally written by the Reverend Spalding Spalding as a romance entitled The Manuscript Found, placed by him in the printing office of Patterson Lambden in the city of Pittsburgh, from whence it was taken by a conspicuous Mormon divine, remodeled by adding the religious portion placed by him in Smith's possession, and then published it to the world as the testimony exemplifies. This I have from the Confederation, that means the inner circle of Joseph Smith. And of its perfect correctness, there is not a shadow of a doubt. There never were any plates of the Book of Mormon excepting what were seen by the spiritual and not the natural eyes of the witnesses. The story of the plates is all chimerical. Now, this is a really interesting testimony, even though there is a few details wrong here. Remember how we told about Austin Fife at the very beginning? He said, "Hey, why didn't Joseph Smith give why did he give credit that he's the one that came up with the Book of Mormon?" Well, it's so interesting that James Jeffrey, who lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and this is after Joseph Smith had died in 1844, and so Rigdon, he wanted to take over the LDS Church. He did not get it, and so he retreated and went back through St. Louis. So it's interesting what James Jeffrey says. "I know more about the Mormons than any man east of the Alleghenies, although I have given no attention to the matter for 25 years. I did not know I was in possession of any information concerning the Book of Mormon unknown to others. I suppose that as Rigdon was so open with me, he had told others the same things. And 40 years ago, I was in business in St. Louis. Mormons that had their temple in Nauvoo. I had business transactions with them. Sidney Rigdon I knew very well. He was general manager of the affairs of the Mormons. Rigdon in hours of conversation told me a number of times there was in the printing office with which he was connected in Ohio a manuscript of Reverend Spalding, tracing the origin of the Indian race from the lost tribes of Israel, and that this manuscript was in the office for several years, that he was familiar with it, that Spalding had wanted it printed, but he had not the money to pay for the printing. And this is the part I think he's wrong about, that he, Rigdon, and Joe Smith used to look over the manuscript and read it over Sundays." So I just find it very interesting that we have Nauvoo, Illinois, John C. Bennett. You have St. Louis, Missouri, James Jeffrey. You have in Bainbridge, Ohio, Amarillo Dunlap, Dempsey Thompson. You have in Amity, Pennsylvania, Joseph Miller, Reddick McKee, Matilda Davidson. And then you got Pittsburgh, Rebecca Eibom, and John Winter. So I just find that very interesting. How the manuscript does indeed travel from Pittsburgh to Amity. And of course, we know that Rigdon took it to Bainbridge, and then, of course, took it to eventually, well, we don't know what he did with it, to be honest. But we know that John C. Bennett learned about it from the Confederation. And then when Sidney Rigdon was not able to become guardian of the LDS Church, I bet he was angry and he was frustrated, and he just let the secret out, to be honest. And he told in St. Louis, Missouri, James Jeffrey that. Okay. Now, moving forward. All right, so now we got all those witnesses who made the connection between Sidney Rigdon and the manuscript. Now, this one here, we're going to see a connection between, so that Rigdon had foreknowledge of the Book of Mormon before his conversion in November of 1830. Now, remember that James Jeffrey, remember that Austin Fife was like, okay, why, how do you say it? He said, yeah. All right, so if it's true that Sidney Rigdon was the author of the Mormon Bible, how was he converted in November 1830 by the book he wrote in 1829? Then he never took credit for it? Okay, so here's an interesting thing that we see from these people, okay? And I wish we could read all of these, but it's very interesting. We're just going to read parts of it. Now, Adamson Bentley was the brother-in-law to Sidney Rigdon. He says, I know that Sidney Rigdon told me there was a book coming out, the manuscript of which had been found engraved on gold plates, as much as 2 years before the Mormon book made its appearance in this country or had been heard of by me. The same I communicated to Brother Alexander Campbell. And Alexander Campbell wrote about this years later. He says the conversion alluded to in Brother Bentley's letter of 1841 was in my presence as well as in his, as my recollection of it led me some 2 or 3 years ago to interrogate Brother Bentley, touching his recollection of it, which accorded with mine in every particular except the year in which it occurred. He placing it in the summer of 1827, I in the summer of 1826. Rigdon at the same time observing that in the plates dug up in New York there was an account not only of the aborigines of this country but also a state of the Christian religion had been preached in this country during the first century, just as we were preaching on the Western Reserve. So I believe maybe both Bentley and Campbell might be wrong about both of those dates. Maybe 1828 they're thinking about, or it could be 1829. Dr. Stormrosa says in the early part of the year, either May or June of 1830. Now, it's true that the Book of Mormon had been published for 3 months now, at least. March, April, May, June. Several months now. He says, I was in company with Sidney Rigdon and rode with him on horseback a few miles. Our conversation was principled upon the subject of religion, as he was at that time a very popular preacher. The denomination called themselves Disciples or Carmelites. He remarked to me that it was time for a new religion to spring up, that mankind were all ripe and ready for it. I thought he alluded to Campbell doctrine. He said it would not be long for something would make its appearance. He also said he thought of it leaving for Pennsylvania and should be absent for some months. I asked him how long. He said it would depend upon circumstances. I began to think a little strange of his remarks as he was a minister of the gospel. I left Ohio that fall, went to the state of New York to visit my friends who lived in Waterloo, not far from the mine of the Golden Bibles. In November, I was informed that my old neighbor, Partridge, and Sidney Rigdon were in Waterloo, and they both had become the dupes of Joe Smith's necromancies. It then occurred to me that Rigdon's new religion had made its appearance, and when I became informed of the spawning manuscript, I was confirmed in the opinion that Rigdon was at least accessory, if not the principal, in getting up this farce. And information I can give shall be done cheerfully. All right, and then we have Darwin Atwater. He says, the infant church at Mantua was left small and inexperienced. I was the only one who had been accustomed to take an active public part. There was Brother Seth Sanford, Brother Seth Harmon, both very young in the Christian profession with a number of excellent sisters. In our week's stay, in the midst of so much opposition, we were poorly prepared to take care of the church. March 21st, 1830, which is very close to when the printing of the Book of Mormon was done. I was ordained elder in my youth. Brother Seth Harmon was ordained deacon, Adam Bentley officiating. At this time, Oliver Snow, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip a little bit of this. So it says, Sidney Rigdon preached for us, notwithstanding his extravagantly wild freaks. He was held in high repute by many. For a few months before his professed conversion to Mormonism, it was noticed that his wild, extravagant propensities had been more marked. That he knew before the coming of the Book of Mormon is to me certain from what he said of the first of his visits at my father's some years before. He gave a wonderful description of the mounds and other antiquities found in some parts of America, said that they must have been made by the aborigines. He said that there was a book to be published containing an account of these things, and he spoke of these in his eloquent, enthusiastic style as being a thing most extraordinary. Thomas Clapp says, Elder Addison Bentley told me that he was one day riding with Sidney Rigdon, conversing upon the Bible. Mr. Rigdon told him that another book of equal authority with the Bible, as well authenticated and as ancient, which would give an account of the history of the Indian tribes on this continent, with many other things of great importance to the world, would soon be published. This was before Mormonism was ever heard of in Ohio, and when it appeared, the avidity with which Rigdon received it convinced him that if Rigdon was not the author of it, he was at least acquainted with the whole matter sometime before it was published to the world. And John Rudolph, for 2 years before the Book of Mormon appeared, Rigdon's sermons were full of declarations of prophecies that the age of miracles would be restored, more complete revelations than those in the Bible be given. And when the Book of Mormon appeared, all who heard him were satisfied that he referred to it. In the annual meeting of the Mahoning Association held in Austintown, August 1830, about 2 months before Sidney Rigdon's professed conversion to Mormonism, Rigdon preached Saturday afternoon. After he had much to say about a full and complete restoration of the ancient gospel, he spoke in his glowing style of what the disciples had accomplished. That he contended that we had glowing that we had not accomplished a complete restoration of apostolic Christianity. He contended such a restoration must include a community of goods, which, interesting enough, is found in the Book of Mormon, holding on common stock, and a restoration of the spiritual gifts of the apostolic age, which still happens also, and we found in the Book of Mormon. He promised that although we had not come up to the apostolic plan in full, yet as we were improving, God would soon give us a full and fuller revelation of his will. And after the Book of Mormon had been read by many who heard Rigdon on that occasion, they were perfectly satisfied that Rigdon knew all about that book when he preached that discourse. Rigdon's sermon was most thoroughly refuted by Brother Campbell, which very much offended Rigdon. My parents came to Ohio from Vermont in 1815. I resided in Kirtland when the Mormons first arrived. I was personally acquainted with Rigdon. I have heard him say several times in his sermons that before long, the Indian mountains and forts about there would all be explained. He caused a row of log houses to be built on Isaac Morley's farm, established a communistic society before Mormonism was heard of. I heard Rigdon preach his first sermon at Kirtland Flats after he embraced Mormonism. He said he had been preaching wrong doctrines and asked for forgiveness. And you got Samuel F. Whitney. I heard Sidney Rigdon preach in Squire Sawyer's orchard in 1827 or 1828. He said, how desirable it would be to know who built the forts and mounds about the country, so it would all be revealed. He undoubtedly referred to the Book of Mormon, which was published in 1830. I have heard Mrs. Mand and other members of Rigdon's church say that weeks before he joined the Mormons, he took the Bible and slapped it down on the desk, said in a short time it would be of no more account than an old almanac, that there was to be a new Bible, a new revelation, which would entirely do away with this. Miss S.W. Hansen, soon after, you can read that for yourself. So, what's our point here? Our point is that we have several people who make the claim that Sidney Rigdon had known about the Book of Mormon before his conversion in November of 1830. Now, it is the case, and we concede that we know that the Book of Mormon was published in 1830 of March, and so the statements are after March of 1830, but some of them are before that. And it's interesting that newspaper articles, so it was in the summer of 1829 when they started to talk about that there's this Golden Bible coming out. So before the summer of 1829, how would it have been the case for Sidney Rigdon to have known of these matters? That's a good question. Unless you're the one who is the one who made it, right? And who can talk about it. All right, and then there's a connection between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. And we have these connections. Now, some people are going to say, well, some of these statements are just very weak. Okay, that may be the case. And you can read about Pomeroy Tucker. You can read about Mrs. Eaton, Abel Chase, and they all discuss this matter of how Joseph Smith. Now we don't know exactly how, when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon first met each other. We just don't have the information. Well, but think about it, friends. If you're trying to keep things under wraps, then you're not going to let these things out, right? Okay. So if they did get together, wouldn't there be some gaps in the timeline? And it so happens that, and this is taken from Charles Shook book, The True Origin of the Book of Mormon, but they tried to find everything, all the activities that Sidney Rigdon was involved in. He was involved in, performing wedding ceremonies and signing off those wedding ceremonies and stuff of that nature. But you can see how there's some gaps. There's a gap about 1 month, 1827. And it so happens that some of these gaps is when the people said, hey, this is the time when Sidney Rigdon met Joseph Smith at this particular point in time. So I find that very, coincidental. Okay. And then you find in 1828 down there, baptized June of 1828, gap of possibly 2 months. Now, what's interesting about this is when that 116 lost pages happened. And I would say that someone had to go see Sidney Rigdon and tell him what happened. and Sidney Rigdon is going to have to do the replacement text. And then there's an October of 1828, gap of 2 months and a half. And then 1829 of May, gap of possibly 1 month and a half. January of 1830, gap of possibly 2 months. Gap of Mentor, March of 1830, gap of 2 months. Then there's one in August of 1830, gap of easily 2.5 months. Now, that's kind of interesting. We know that he met Alexander Campbell there in Austintown, Ohio. Now, it's very interesting what happens after that. Okay. So, all of these things connect together. You got Solomon Spaulding, who wrote Manuscript Found. You got Sidney Rigdon, who took the manuscript and put the religious material into it. And then you have Rigdon, who had foreknowledge of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, in which there was Smith and Rigdon who knew each other prior to Rigdon's conversion in November of 1830. And we base this on all of these testimonies. Really, what this all comes down to is, which set of witnesses are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the 11 witnesses who, with regards to the plates, or are you going to believe the testimonies of these people here? In which there are some, to me, now there's some weak testimonies, but and I know that there's some secondhand testimonies in some or thirdhand testimonies in some of these, but there are some that are very strong and very interesting. And that's something that we need to think about. Now, I want to talk about a little bit of Solomon Spaulding and the war. Notice the details that summarize his life. He had war experience because he was in the Revolutionary War. He had a little bit for a law education under Zephaniah Swift. He had a classics education from Dartmouth College. He had a curiosity about the first inhabitants. He had biblical knowledge because he was a minister. He was a preacher. He wrote in the old style, as they said, and they called him "Oh, come to pass," because he wrote about "Oh, and it came to pass" so many times, and which, interesting enough, it's found in the Book of Mormon so many times, and they had to remove many of those phrases from later editions. And he had the ability to write. Okay. We see as a case, and this is something that's very interesting. If you really look at Captain Moroni, read Alma 43 through 63. See how he would have wrote this is pure Spaulding material. Now, there is some Bible phrases made, like "stand fast in liberty which Christ has set us free," Galatians 5:1. But if you read Alma 43 through 63 through Helaman 1 through 3, very interesting. In which I believe Captain Moroni definitely is a person who represents George Washington. And it's interesting to look at these Revolutionary War ideas and see how they're used. It talks about, how the Tories, for example, the people who were loyal to England. All right, and then there's frequent word patterns. So you can read about how they did a word analysis. And I know that this is debatable and there's controversy over this. But it's really interesting. Okay, so I just find it interesting that Alma or Mosiah, Alma, and Helaman, which you see there with those red marks, that it really is where Spaulding's material was, original material. Mosiah 29, it talks about the law system, how they would no longer have kings but turn to a system of judges. Yeah, I could see how Solomon Spaulding put that there, which that would have been right about there. There's the classics education. So Solomon Spaulding was familiar with Roman writers like Tacitus, Livy, Suetonius, Greek writers of Homer, Herodotus, and many others. And so this is from Lars Nilsson, and he did a good job on this, I thought. and showing that, okay, it's interesting in the mind of Solomon Spaulding how he actually made up characters' names. He would use these prefixes, these roots, and suffixes. Wow, suffixes. It's hard to say. And so you can see how he would have drawn these from other people. And so what's interesting is like we have this first manuscript, and you can see a pattern, right? Ham, lamb, right, and ram. All right, these character names share unique word patterns. Nielsen actually constructed this. You can see on the left-hand side there's manuscript story, and on the second-hand side there's the manuscript found. And so you got Ham on the manuscript story side, but then he dropped the H and made it But you can see Gad, Gid, Kor, More, so to speak. So Anti, Kor, and then you have Zen, Z, Hel, More, She, Iha, Ha. Okay. And comes from Grant Hardy in his Reader's Edition. So just showing you Anti, Kor, Gid, Hel, More, She, Zir, Zen, Zor. Okay. So you can see how he would have come up with these. And then you have even Spaulding's River of Waters. So the only one I want to talk about here, and I would suggest you actually look up watch Lars Nilsson's video on this. But so near Pittsburgh, there is what's called the Kishkamentis River. So very interesting enough, there is a character named Kishkamen. So you can see how he would have developed this name, Kishkamen, and the band of Kishkamen. I mean, it's very, very plausible to see how these things would have been made. There's where the Kishkamentis River is found. So I'm just giving you some ideas. I'm giving you some things. There's no way we can spend. Lars spends a lot more time with this, and so I suggest you check out his work. Then there's a curiosity about first inhabitants, which his daughter talked about, and how he went to Dartmouth. He went into the ministry, so that's where he gained his biblical knowledge. And then the witnesses say he wrote in the old style, and they called him "Oh, come to pass." "Oh, come to pass" has come to life again. So it's very interesting, in which it's found 1,404 times in the Book of Mormon. Now, like we said, it's not used in manuscript story. So interesting enough, with manuscript story being that first manuscript, there's a different title. I mean, obviously, manuscript story, Conway Creek, manuscript found. There's a different group, Romans rather than Israelites. It was never finished. It has missing pages, as abrupt ending, which means it's not fit for publication. And that's why it stopped near the beginning of 1812. But we have manuscript found, different title, Lost Tribes of Israel, fit for publication, needed security money, and it started near the beginning of 1812. And then we see is all these details. Now this is where I'm going to mention the details of the witnesses. I didn't read all of the accounts to you. So they talk about how it's a historical novel, first settlers of America, descendants of the American Indians, that there's a journey from Jerusalem, the judgment on the old world. Nephi, Lehi, Mormon, and Moroni are some of the character names, quarrels and contentions, separated into two nations, Nephi, Lamanites and Nephites, bloody wars, arts and sciences, it came to pass, no religious matter. At the first, he's right. But now there's religious matter. That's what makes it an undesigned coincidence. Old obsolete style, I Nephi, which is found around 80 times. Account of Laban, the red mark on the foreheads, which found in Alma 3. Straits of Darien, which that's a different location from where the people in manuscript story landed. There's humorous passages. I mean, there's some funny things that happen in the Book of Mormon. I think about Ammon and him chopping off the arms of those guys. It's pretty funny. Well, and then I think about Ether, that contains some humorous passages. And there's a record hidden in the earth. So manuscripts down, historical novel, first settlers of America, American Indians, descendants of the Israelites, the journey from Jerusalem, Nephi and Lehi, quarrels and contentions separated into two nations, bloody wars, art, sciences, and civilizations, and it came to pass. No religious material, forts and mounds, old obsolete style, judgments came upon the old world. The account of Laban, which interesting enough is found in 1 Nephi 4 through 7, I believe it is. Humorous passages, Moroni, Straits of Darien, I Nephi. So you see all of these. Now, what I want to do next is we're going to stop there, and I'm going to we're gonna pick up from this. But let's stop here for a moment because we've gone for an hour and 10 minutes. So we're going to stop and take a break, and I'm going to come back to this.